Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana May and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing for the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday.
So super excited. Today we are celebrating our 100th episode.
I cannot believe we are already at 100. That is so crazy.
It's insane.
So crazy.
It's insane. So she forced me to do at least 100. I'm kidding. She didn't.
Many months ago, you came to me. I was like, if we're going to do this,
we're not going to do 5 and then disappear.
No.
Do 100.
People have trust issues already. You need to do 100.
At least 100. That's kind of how we started. So neither one of us wanted to do like short season and then suddenly stop. I mean, there is so much within our own artistic journeys as well as those others that we're just like, we just want to share it forward. There's so much we want to make. So we made a serious commitment to the podcast. So here we are.
Yeah. Which, spoiler, we are not stopping at 100.
No.
Let's put that out there.
Oh, wait,
I've had a few people ask that.
No, we're recording more?
Oh, wait. Awkward.
Just kidding.
Actually, this is it. This is end.
No, we wouldn't do that to you guys. Plus, we already have other podcast guests lined up. We're definitely not going to be there.
Yeah.
That's fine. You all would get at least 3 months advance notice.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's go with that. But back in the day, circa 2019, we both met at an art critique in downtown Raleigh. Some of you that have heard our podcast before have heard some of the story. And we quickly, found common ground. I mean, we were outside chatting and it was like freezing cold. We were like talking on that. So even though we are from very different backgrounds, upbringings, education, a lot of different things, cultures, states we grew up in, I mean, it's a lot different. We quickly realized that we both had a common goal to succeed as career-minded artists. So this is where we're here. So in the spirit of community over competition, we started exchanging information and ideas. And it's like, wait, so you have a background in marketing and, you did business school instead of art school. And then you went to art school, but work in marketing. And it's like, wait, let's put our powers together.
Yeah.
Essentially, let's help each other out.
And I feel like that's one of those, I mean, we talk about a lot on the podcast. If you're a listener of the podcast or even have met us in person, when people ask, like, they think we've been friends a lot longer than we have. I mean, it has been 4 years now, which is crazy. But it was definitely, at least for me, one of those like movie, did we instantly just become best friends moments? Because it was finding someone on that same level, which I think a lot of artists, especially that we've talked to since having community-facing studios at Art Space, we talked to a lot of artists of like finding those creative connections. And I feel so, so lucky to be able to have you and all the other artists here at Art Space and the listeners to our podcast that reach out to us on social media and talk to us in person and talk to us about the episodes. It's finding people that get it. Right? The creative minds and being a modern day artist. What does that mean? And that's really why we started the podcast. We wanted to be able to share forward. Oh, we had these conversations that really started during COVID. Mm-hmm. We'd have weekly check-ins every Monday. I would go for a long walk and we would just talk about what podcasts are you listening to? What books are you reading? What are you working on in your studio? And getting advice from each other and other artists that like, oh, I wish I knew that 2 years ago or 6 months ago. It would have saved me so much time.
Exactly.
So that's really where our thought and really our foundation for sharing it forward as a theme for the podcast. So we definitely had to figure out a lot of problems along the way, went through a lot of rabbit holes of research when it came to the podcast of how do you create a podcast? Where do you host it? What is the structure of each episode going to look like? What technology do we need? All of the rabbit hole decisions. But then on May 4th, 2021, Star Wars Day, we decided to officially launch the podcast. It started as Art Studio Insights. If you're an OG listener, you may remember that. And we quickly switched it to Level Up Artists because we found a lot of what we were talking about was how do you take what you're doing now and level up? It may be 2% better or 5%, but figure out what do I need to do to be more intentional with my practice, to level up my business, and to really see what it means to be a career-minded artist. So now we have over 100 episodes,
Yes.
including 30, not 300 yet,
Yes.
over 30 artist interviews, which I think has been such an awesome addition to our podcast of interviewing other artists and curators and book authors, art professionals, collectors, and really hearing their input of their experiences, what they've learned and what their creative journeys have listened to. Even just with artists, I mean, it's been painters and sculptors and photographers, graphic designers, installation art, public art, muralists, which honestly, sometimes I feel a bit selfish in the best way of like, I'm actually just really curious about this topic. Let's get artists on that already have that experience and talk to them about what tools do they need? What problems do they face? What do they wish they had known before they got into this type of medium? And then we get to share it with the rest of the world and with you guys on the podcast of like questions that we're having. And we know that if we're having the questions, other artists are too. So being able to host those discussions and work with some local nonprofits too. We've been so fortunate to be able to partner with local nonprofits to do panel discussions on very niche topics. Again, bringing the experts in to where we remember feeling isolated in our home studios and making work and being like, scavenging the internet of like YouTube videos and research of specific topics within the arts industry that we're like, wow, I wish I just had an expert to ask questions to. And now we get to do that on the podcast, which is so fun.
Yes. And as an artroverted artist, for me, it's kind of hard sometimes to talk to people.
Yeah.
And the podcast, amongst other things, has given me the quote unquote blanket excuse to be able to talk to somebody that maybe I'm too shy to just straight up talk to them if I don't know them, and basically say, hey, I love that you do XYZ, or I love your murals, or I love your photography. Would you like to come onto the podcast? Right? Like it gives me that icebreaker, if you will, in many ways to kind of talk about it, or maybe just tell them, have you heard our podcast? I'd love you to listen to it. But also another thing is throughout those 30 interviews, something I'm very proud that we've done is I like to call it a variety pack, is how I like to joke it. It's not just the difference in mediums. We also have a wide variety of experience levels. So we have some artists that left college not that long ago, and we have artists that have been doing this for 40, 50 years, right? We also have artists that are LGBTQ, or they are Black, or they're Asian, or like they're just like ethnically and culturally diverse as well. So even though a lot of them, and for the most part, the folks that we're talking to are in our general geographic area, we've had a few folks that actually are in other states and other countries too. So it's very exciting. I can't wait to keep, bringing some of these conversations on, I forgot too. We have artists that bartend on the weekends and do art on the side. We have full-time artists. We have everybody in between.
Yeah.
Teachers and professors. And anyways, we have the full gamut in just 30 interviews. This is insane.
Yeah.
So I can't wait to see how else we continue expanding that. But it's definitely interesting how all these episodes later, our podcast mission and pillars are still the same. Like looking back at some of our first episodes, it was kind of surprising. Some of those early episodes were like, so here's what we're hoping to do with the podcast. And 100 episodes later, we're still doing it.
Yeah.
It's connecting with others. Check. Sharing it forward. Check. And most importantly, or one of the most important, is to demystify that creative process and just show people how it's done.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing too, thinking back to when we first thought of the idea of having our podcast. It was like peak COVID when we first were thinking about it. And like, I think you came into my studio one day and we were like in one of our like
exchanging
brainstorming sessions that would last honestly like hours and hours, because summer of 2020, like what else is there to do?
We were in the same bubble, so we were one of the few people that could talk to each other like in person.
Yeah. And having someone in your bubble that was like, well, none of us have plans and we're just in our studio, so like let's just sit. And I feel like we were really just like casting our dreams, both as emerging artists, new to a public facing art studio, and also just like anything felt possible at that time, which I feel so fortunate thinking back on that. But also when thinking of the podcast, we spent hours being like very intentional of what do we want it to be? What do we want to represent? And who do we want to serve with our information? Mm-hmm. What voices do we want to highlight and intentionally lift up as we're learning from the experts and professionals around us? Yes, from the arts industry, but also just as with most creative mediums, like as voices in this world, in life, not to get too woo-woo about it, but like, who do you want to lift up? And I think being very intentional with that early on. Yes, there's an element of failing forward and learning as we went. And there may be one or two episodes that we recorded, just her and I, where the audio quality is terrible or like a video is like totally off-centered or something. But so there's an element of learning for sure. But I do think being very intentional with creative projects is something that is still showing why we are 100 episodes later and still doing what we're doing, which is so fun.
Yeah, I feel very proud of the work we've done. But I want to drop some stats real quick, which to us, like once we were looking at the numbers, it's like, I don't know, it's just kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, especially because we started just doing this. Yes, we wanted 100 episodes, but besides that and like the quality of the conversations, that was our only like marker for success. We didn't think about how many subscribers or listeners, or like, it was just about the work itself.
Exactly.
You know,
or like that can come later, if it's going to, but for us, it was more important to document some of our journey, document and share, of course, share forward. You'll hear us say this all the time, but basically taking some of that information that other artists had generally shared and documented, have it there for other people to access later on, memorialize it, if you will. But over 100 episodes, well, today's 100, of course.
Next week it'll be over 100.
Exactly. Over 1,700 minutes of content created just in 2022 alone. And we're about to double that once we hit 104 weeks of recording.
We've also never missed a week.
We've never missed a week, which is amazing. I know. Nice. We've had thousands of downloads, so people clicking and listening in, it's amazing. And then just based on the amount of content created, according to Spotify, we had 97 more content than other art podcasts, which just leads me to believe maybe there were a lot that just got started and never finished, or they're very short versus we have like meaty content, especially when we have like interviews or more in-depth, like longer episodes versus somebody that might just do 10-minute episodes.
Right. And the consistency being the biggest thing.
Yes. Yeah. Because some other folks will only do like one podcast a month or every other week, and we do weekly every Tuesday. So that's awesome. Finding out we have listeners from all over the world, that was insane. Looking at like the map breakdown, mainly US and Canada, surprise of course, but actually the one that like I didn't expect was Australia, and then another one that came up was actually Germany, and I'm like, huh? Hey,
you never know. We support all artists around the world.
Yes, we do. This is awesome. And then mainly our number one platform is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and then of course YouTube.
Yeah. And it's so fun being able to share on so many different platforms. People can consume it in the ways they want. But as we've gone now, we're at episode 100, and we've had 3 of our top episodes. If you maybe are a new listener to the podcast and want to go back and hear some of the crowd favorites, our top 3 have been Building Relationships and Increasing Exposure with Clarence Hayward, episode 46, our Create Before You Consume episode, which is episode 2, which I think is very interesting. Probably as our momentum was building with the podcast, people start from the beginning and
but they keep listening to it.
I know. I'm not questioning it. It is a good episode. It's an evergreen episode too. It's always applicable. It's a good reminder. So Create Before You Consume. And then Leading an Artful Career with Purpose with Carly Jones, episode 52. So as the CEO of Artspace, all of our guests have been so wonderful. And it's great hearing about, as we keep saying, like everyone's experiences, the diverse range. But there are 3 questions that we ask every guest. And so if you've listened to our podcast before, you already know what these questions are. We end every podcast with them. So we're going to go through. We thought it would be fun to go and talk about maybe some of the answers that we found most memorable. Of
Mhm.
course, everyone's take is typically surprising, but makes sense for the content of the interview, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Mhm.
Everyone's lens makes sense. So let's go through those questions now and see what some of our favorites were. So the first one that we asked every artist and guest on our podcast is, how do you define success as an artist? So for that question, what are some of your most memorable answers?
So, one of my most memorable, and no surprise because it's actually one of our top episodes, was our friend, fellow artist Clarence Hayward. Hey, Clarence, if you're listening. So that was episode 46, and the way he encapsulated or kind of gave his answer, which, by the way, as we read these to you guys or share with these guys, quick disclosure, these are not direct quotes necessarily.
No.
Some of them we had to paraphrase, so keep that in mind when you go back and listen, for brevity, because otherwise you'd be here all day. Anyways, disclosure out of the way. So Clarence, definitely one of my favorites. He's one of our earlier interviews, actually. And the way he basically put it is, how do you define success? I get up every day and paint. I don't have to worry about paying the mortgage or studio rent. The paintings actually pay the bills. Exhibitions and everything else are a bonus. I don't need fame and fortune. I just need it to generate enough to cover financial responsibilities while still having time to paint. To me, that was like the quintessential answer.
Preach.
Exactly. And for
Yeah.
me, I was like, that right there is the dream. Like, as a full-time artist, I get to pay my share of the bill, sure, but I do want it to be sustainable and
Right.
like consistent income enough, which working on it, we're getting there. To where I can say that and just say, like, I paint every day, I do ceramics every day, kind of thing. Okay, maybe with some rest days in between. Um, working on that too. But I thought that was really classic, and I really loved it because it shows too that sense of responsibility. So it's not like, oh, I paint whenever I feel like. It's like, no, there's still a discipline aspect within that answer. Maybe not apparent right away, but it's there. So I love that. And then our other one that I actually really liked, as I was like thinking about this question, was actually our first interview ever with our studio neighbor, Jane Cheek, down the hallway from me. Actually closer down the hallway from you. That was actually episode 18. So she was our
Early
first
on.
ever.
Yeah.
She was so gracious in saying yes. She helped us figure out a lot of the technology and how to do interviews. So that was great. And with her answer, she said, you have to focus on the work. You have to make something you're proud of in order to be successful, and also practice, 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 while also thinking about keeping it a sustainable art practice. So much like Clarence, there's also that element of discipline that's involved in it, and that work ethic, which I absolutely love. And I resonate with that message that they both had. How about you?
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that's, common with all of our guests is, especially for those that, which honestly, all of the artists that we've had on the podcast are career minded artists. So they think of, yes, we are so fortunate as artists to be able to have our craft, but it is also a business. And I think for me, Jamaica Gilmer was one that really stuck out to me, episode 75, because she is insanely creative as a photographer, but also very type A and structured. And so she said she defines success by, with each project, she asked herself, did I set out, or did I do what I set out to do? And if she did, how did that feel? Did it feel good in her body? And how is she going to use that experience to move forward? Which I really, really loved that, because it's acknowledging the element of self-reflection that is required in the creative process, because also maybe you set out what you set to do and that's great and you move on, but okay, if you didn't do what you set out to do, what does that mean? Are you disappointed? Are you going to try again? Or is it time to say, okay, this isn't meant for me and it felt very forced and therefore I need to pivot? And both things, I think it's the perfect example of saying everything's a learning lesson. And especially, you're not beating yourself up. You're not saying like, oh, I missed the mark, I'm a failure, I can't make anything ever again, but acknowledging and holding space for that self-reflection. Because at least in my journey, I know so many other artists, the goal really of our creative practices can be and is a constant journey of personal growth
Mhm.
and personal reflection. And the output may be a creative product, but you're just constantly learning so much about yourself, how you view the world, and how you interact with the space around you. So I thought that was super wonderful of taking that time for self-evaluation after a project, and even just the self-reflection time is the successful part of the creative project.
Yeah, so it's not like an external measurement, it's actually internal. And
Yeah,
that's something I really liked about it, and it's like you said, it's not beating yourself up about it, it's just saying, did did that align with my goals or not, and how do I change it
exactly.
instead?
And especially when thinking about the external versus internal, thinking about the next question we ask everyone is, what is the piece of advice you wish you had heard before you got started on your creative journey? And I always think of Jason Blyskool, episode 73, because I loved the way he talked about, like, think about everything that you make is the right answer, because the only question you have to ask yourself is, like, then if you like it or not. Because if it was an idea for you, then it's the correct answer is pursuing that, right? As artists, we have these fleeting ideas, and if you take action on it, then something was propelling you, whether it was logic or the universe or any woo woo answer that, I mean, the magic of creativity gets assigned. It's thinking about, I mean, nature, it was the first art form, right? And nature doesn't witness itself. One flower is what we talked about in the episode. Like, one flower doesn't look around and say, wow, look at all these other beautiful flowers. It just kind of
It just
is beautiful. It is the natural flow of nature. And so I think often, especially myself as a type A, I can really get in my own head and overanalyze and over put systems and structure, which, like, organization and structure is great, especially for the
Mhm.
business sides that we talk about in the podcast. But it was just like such a refreshing conversation of, like, get out of your own head and just kind of similar to Jane, like, just make art, make what feels right to you, because everyone's creative journeys look so different, which was probably my second most memorable conversation or answer to that question of what advice do you have, was Carly Jones' advice in episode 52. So she talked about how everyone's career looks differently. It ebbs and it flows. And especially as an incredibly talented woman like her, who has multiple disciplines in which she expresses herself, both from a performance standpoint, but being a professional in the arts field. I mean, your work as some may see like admin or meeting structure, all of that, it's in the art. So you're expressing yourself in a different way. So even if you're not actively practicing your art form or not at the scale you quote unquote wish you should be doing it, you're still an artist, right? Like, that's a talent that no one can take away from you. And one quote that she shared was, you can have it all, but you can't always have it all at the same time. Which, that was kind of like a mic drop moment for me as someone who loves
Mhm.
putting a million things on my own plate. And okay, I can do everything. Getting, like, I think as artists too, we can also get defensive in that way. Like, oh, I could do that, or I could do this, but there's not enough hours in the day, right? Like, it's so much about time management. So we all have those phases of pausing one creative venture to pursue another, or moments of burnout, or moments of just pausing after a big project. And that advice was so comforting to hear, that even when you're on a pause, you're still an artist and there's still a future creative project that's waiting to come to life.
Yeah, I think that was one of my favorite things of what Carly said, was that idea of like that pause. Like, that
Mm,
doesn't stop you from being an artist. If you're an artist, you're an artist.
yeah. And it can be 2 weeks or it could
Maybe
be
years.
5 years. Like, and it's of course a time of self-reflection. And we've talked about that, of burnout and all those things, but it's just a very comforting to hear of
Yeah.
everyone goes through that. And that's definitely a common theme through a lot of the stories that we hear.
Yeah. And she was an interesting one to talk to too, not just because obviously she runs the art spaceship, but also from that idea that she came from performance art. She still does performance art and is doing art administration as well.
Mhm.
And actually that led me to the next person that I want to bring up, which is Natalie Daisy, who is also came from a different part of art. So Natalie actually was doing TV before doing painting, which is very interesting. And one of the things that stuck out from her episode, which was episode 59, is that she would say, I am myself and I don't need to work like anybody else. So this actually resonates with that whole flower comparing itself. She would say, comparison is deadly. If I am true to myself, that's all I really need. Yes, learn and grow, have experiences, take classes, get on YouTube, figure out how to use the tools and the paint. But most importantly, your own unique work is what you are supposed to do. That's it. And don't compare yourself to others. So much like some of the other folks that we're highlighting, it goes back again to that internal structure is more important than the external. Obviously, some of these are like, what advice would you give somebody else, which technically is external. But it's still not saying the advice is go and look at what somebody else did and go from there. It's more like, no, you need to trust yourself. So I thought that was a very interesting one, especially too, it was a kids' TV show. And then painting, and it's like,
people are so creative. And I think that's what's so interesting is seeing all of the many art forms in which artists can express themselves, both from a professional sense, but also side projects. And then, they also know an instrument. They're musicians. It's like a whole other form of creativity.
Yeah.
So
and then
fun.
seeing how it all translates. So it's like you can have someone that was performance that is now a visual artist, for example, because that's actually that's her case, right? And she was also doing like during shows. And anyways, it was very interesting. So definitely hear that one too. And then another one that I really liked, speaking of people that come from other areas, was Shieko Murasugi, which was episode 76. A scientist turned artist. What? So we talked about the scientific method and how it overlaps into the art practice. But some of the things that stuck out to me that I thought were gold was she said, especially when you are starting out, that's the time when you can afford to take risks. Don't take the safe option every time. We're not saying be reckless, but do venture out and try new things. So maybe art is the risky one. We're not saying quit your job, whatever. Maybe you just do it on the side, or there's a new medium that's calling to you. You don't have to stay in your lane, especially when you're starting out. You can venture out. But then Shelsha shared, I want to be an artist that's respected in my community, and there's room for change in how that community is defined. So at one point for her community was fellow studio artists at Golden Belt. It expanded to Chapel Hill, which is the city where she's located, and then the Triangle area and beyond. So I thought that was interesting too, of like, we're not islands. Yes, we create by ourselves, and most artists that I know, the vast majority of them, we're alone when we're creating, but we are part of a larger ecosystem, kind of like what we do with the podcast. We're sharing with other people, we're exchanging resources, and there's space for that. And that part about respect, I thought was very, very good. It's not just being conscious that they're around you. It's also like, you're commanding respect, you're being a role model. Like, what can you do? It's not just the art you make. I feel like that ties into that idea of like, how do you give back? How do you contribute to the community that's around you, which I think is really important.
Yeah. And that's definitely been, I think, a theme with a lot of the conversations is both connecting to the community around you for your own enjoyment and fulfillment as an artist, because I think that's one of the hardest ways, which we have episodes about it, of like, I'm new to a city. How do I get, quote unquote, in the art scene, or where do I look? But also lifting up other voices and learning, having it be that exchange, which is what makes the arts so powerful.
Yep. And then another one of the questions we ask everybody was, if somebody were to hand you $100, what would you use it on? It has to be, something you're passionate about, art related, business related, etc. Overwhelmingly, I mean, we're not going to quote everybody. A lot of people would say art supplies. I'm going to go to Jerry's or Rama or Blake and spend it on paint and tools and tickets to art related events. Or they actually would take the business side of it and would say things like, I would like equipment like a better webcam or a tripod or a microphone or things like that. So those were very practical.
Yeah. And the one thing with this question, we intentionally made it $100 because depending on everyone's financial situation, 100 can feel like no money at all. You spend that in the morning and forget about it. Or being in a place where that is a lot of money, and being in those phases of life where I have felt that of like, okay, what can I do? And like this $100 has to be spent very intentionally
Mm-hmm.
and like making it go as far as it can, especially when you're launching an art business. If you're looking to pursue it as a career and you have finances potentially separate for personal or whatever the
Mm-hmm.
situation of, okay, I just sold this painting or this art print. Now, how do I reinvest it in my
Mm-hmm.
business?
Can I set aside $100 out of that sale?
Right. And wanting to get advice on, okay, what are things that would really make an impact in their business?
Yeah, and one of the ones that I really like, this was a long but very fun episode, definitely highly recommended, was Dr. Amanda Maples, curator at the NCMA, and Sean Richards, super mega talented artist. They're a couple, so that was a fun one. And what they ended up agreeing on was they would take those $100 and actually use it for non-art related fun things. So they mentioned like, well, travel might not take you so far, maybe do meals on the airplane, as well as like going out on a nice dinner date or even doing video games. So I thought that was very interesting, where it was like almost like let's spend it on something that recharges our energy so that we continue to do art related things, but the investment itself was into them.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought that was, I don't know, it was adorable.
And that's ultimately, I mean, we talk about as artists, like you are the magic, like you are the commonality between each of your paintings, between the connection with your painting and your art business. And similarly, Kelly Walker had a similar answer of using that $100 to take someone out to dinner. She kind of mentioned it could be from a networking standpoint, sitting down with a fellow artist, whether you talk shop, talk business, or talk about nothing at all related to your business, but really intentionally taking that time to slow down and invest in human connection, I think is one thing that all humans crave, but especially artists, because as you were saying, that is what for many people recharges us and what re-inspires us in our creative journeys. And so there's so many.
Oh, and Kelly was episode 94, by the way.
Episode 94. Yes.
84 for Amanda and Sean, 94 for Kelly.
Yeah. And speaking of recent episodes, now that we're at 100, there's also been amazing conversations that along the way, whether it's those three specific answers or not, have had some pretty surprising moments or surprise guests, I guess you could say, that we've both have kind of stuck with us. One of which was a very recent episode, number 98 for me, of Brian Holland and Diana Wynn, of talking about what it's like being contemporary collectors in the art world. I think mainly for me, because I remember learning about art collectors in college and watching documentaries of people back in like the 1960s and like the 40s that would go to like all these art fairs, which I thought was so cool. And that it sounds so simple, but seeing what it looks like in like a modern day world, like footage in color, like seeing what their collector's house looked like. You're not watching like old footage in a classroom as a homework assignment. So it was super exciting and energizing to talk to the avid collectors, because I started intentionally collecting other artists' work back in 2013. So going on 10 years now, which is very exciting. Of course, in type A fashion, having spreadsheets and documentation and all of where I was, who I bought it from. Yeah, I'm like, my future historians that are studying this collection, when it's in a big fancy museum one day, who knows? They'll thank me for this documentation. And also then if you write it down, you don't have to remember. But it was so fun and also inspiring of seeing, okay, buying a $30 work on paper from one of your favorite local artists, and how you can then invest slowly, whether it's each month. Okay, this year I'm going to set aside X amount of money to invest in other artists that I support and I love the message that they're sharing and I love their stories and I want to own a piece of that. I thought was super inspiring to be able to just like hear the other side of the art world, because we're the artists typically in that relationship.
Yeah, and they were so down to earth too. And they were just like, you got to remember what you do is magic, essentially. Like it's something we can't do. And I don't know, listening to that feedback was great. Also, they were like, remember, we can be introverted too. Like, I don't know, there were a lot of gems in that one, but for sure, I love that down to earth approach and the whole like, you don't need thousands of dollars. You
Yeah.
just start with a print.
Yeah. And I think one of the big things for me of that conversation too was kind of being reminded of the magic of the creative process. For them, they mentioned like what they think what we do as artists is like magic. Like we're like superheroes to them because it's not something they actively spend their time in,
Mhm.
which if you're a listener to the podcast or an artist yourself of you're so in the creative process, you're like, yeah, how else would you fill your time? You like make paintings and make stuff and this is how what we do, so you forget that that's not what everyone does.
Exactly.
Which responding to that magic of the creative process was also part of a conversation we had with Wendy White in episode 78, where sharing her creative journey of using art as a form of healing. So Wendy works at Healing Transitions, which is an organization that I've partnered with a lot. And so I was the chairwoman of their Art of Recovery event, which is now a very, very close to my heart event, an amazing organization as a whole. But they really talk about how art can be a thread for so many people. And I think as artists of self-reflection, of personal healing, art therapy, and really was that aha moment for me because again, I am so type A and very structured. So it's powerful to hear that just being present in your process and the power of that, of using it as a healthy escape from the world, but also time of self reflection. That's the gift of the magic, which is just a very refreshing reminder for us to
Mhm.
have. When you have these big goals, you have these big dreams and aspirations of taking time to reflect and be proud of yourself for what you've done so far.
Yeah,
Super powerful.
for sure. And for me, it's also like you're mentioning like the element of you as an artist. For me too, that reminds me of the element of the viewer as well.
Yeah.
Because for some, like for us, it can be healing for us, but also it allows the opportunity, especially when we're sharing our story. It's so personal and so vulnerable that it's universal and people connect with that. So
Absolutely.
also the person on the other side of the canvas, so to speak, that person that's going to put it on their home can connect to our story, and maybe some of their story reflects ours as well, and there's that new connection and it can be healing for them as well.
Yeah.
So I love how it's not just the one us just making the thing, it's also the person receiving the thing. I don't know, I thought it was pretty amazing. Another episode that really stuck out to me was episode 57 with Peter Marin. So he's the more like teaching professor type, if you will, artist. So I loved his approach, is very process oriented, which again, I resonate with that a lot. And he mentioned that we as artists have two principal roles: to make problems and to solve problems. The work itself, when we begin, is a blank canvas. So there is technically no problem. It's neutral. And so the moment you start working on it, you start creating problems and then you have to solve them. And so the work itself is solving problems that you're creating. It's destruction and construction at the same time. I absolutely love that
Preach.
idea. Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Because it's like sometimes I think there can be this misconception in the public and in the media that gets spread over, that artists are just like lolly lolly la, just like, I don't know, the muse comes and descends upon the easel and magic. I mean, it is magic, don't get me wrong, going back to the
Right.
magic. But like sometimes there's this misconception of like, oh, it just came out of the ether. No, we're problem solving, just like an engineer has to solve a problem of a different sort, of course, or an architect, or someone that works in spreadsheets, or someone that works in IT, right? Someone in landscaping, who knows? We are too. One of the differences, we're the ones making the problem first, right? And then we have to solve it. But there's a lot more of the analytical process to it than seems at first hand, especially if someone doesn't really go into their process and tries to mystify it and just goes, they go from here I am, here's the painting, ta-da, and that's it. And you don't get to see the behind the scenes or any of the context behind it. It just seems like, oh, they just made a thing. It's kind of like fascinating, almost like when you see those behind the scenes of how movies are made, or music video or music and whatnot, and then you get to see the problem solving that goes behind it. That was a great reminder listening to that episode of like, no, 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 there's a lot more that goes behind the scenes. So what you see on that final surface is only that tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and it's so interesting too, getting that perspective. As you mentioned, Peter is a professor and a curator and a professional artist and wears so many hats. And so, of course, in all of those roles, he's making problems, solving problems, and then optimizing on those solved problems. And so it is that reminder of the many roles that we all face. And I think as artists, you can say, oh, why would you just make a problem to solve? But we're also often reacting to and questioning the world around us, which I think that's a huge strength in the creative process is it's all in our own head, right? Like the artwork itself and the craftsmanship is amazing and what is able to be consumed by other people. But that true magic, that process of thinking and questioning and rethinking and re-questioning, that's where that true energy happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's everything. Another one that, came to mind as we were working through these was episode 54 with our friend, artist friend, Susie Silver. And she basically said it's all about when someone engages with the work, when they see it and say statements like, I've never seen something like that before. They may say, I never would have thought of that, or that work makes me feel calm and relaxed, or, fill in the blank. Generating those conversations that actually goes back to what you just said of like, why would we even make the problem? I think sometimes the problem that we're trying to pose and then solve is this is what I'm trying to transmit through the painting. And how do I do that? How do I use the language of visual art to communicate my story or my experience or a feeling that I want the viewer to feel? Or maybe it's a social justice theme that I want them to think about. I mean, there's so many different things that you can transmit through the artwork. And I feel like a lot of times that's exactly what we're trying to solve. And if you can trigger that emotion.
Yeah, that's such a powerful moment. And I hope that any artist out there that wants to share their work experiences moments like that with maybe a future collector or just observer of their work. Because Carly Jones actually shared, not on our podcast episode, but on another one of her many artist talks that she's done, the idea of creating artwork that makes a person in the future feel more seen and comfortable. And that has really stuck with me of whether there's someone in the future or maybe your past self. What is the work that you wish you had in the world when you were younger, when you were in a previous phase of your life that would have made you feel safe or seen or connection with another person? And I think so many of us, I mean, if you go back in art history, there's old masters or amazing artists that we connect to on some level, whether conceptually or just whatever phase. But thinking that we as artists could even have the chance of doing that for someone in the future after we're long past, it's a cool feeling of things that we're making new products and pieces and sharing it with the world. It's a super powerful feeling that you have to remind yourself every day. It's like a privilege that we get to do that.
I know. Legacy.
Yeah,
What
it
does
goes
it
back to
mean?
legacy.
Yeah, it does. What do we want to be known for, and what are we leaving behind in the world? So absolutely. Some of the, like, as we were like talking about the different episodes and preparing for this one, it was just like, oh, there's so much we want to highlight. So obviously we don't have time to highlight all 100 episodes and all 30 interviews.
You just have to go back and listen to all of them.
Please do. They're awesome, especially when you're painting and working and listen in. But some of the overall observations that we got from, especially from the interviews, was all of our guests are so passionate about what they do. And I absolutely love how they just give candid and generous advice, including things to like the highs and lows of their chosen career path. So I thought that was absolute gold. There's a lot of episodes where you're going to hear me say like, oh, that was gold. That was like advice moms and things like that. Cause I'm just like, thank you. Like, thank you for, bringing that to the light. And the other thing was that sometimes, like, especially if we're feeling overwhelmed with all the things we do, we forget we're not alone, or we're not the only ones doing the balancing act. And that's a lot of what was coming up with these interviews. So a lot of the people we talked to, especially artists, they're balancing a lot more than the roles you may expect in a quote unquote traditional job. So an artist may also be their own accountant and customer service, and they do sales and human resources and transport the artwork. And of course, they're also the actual talent. And they're just balancing all these different hats. And sometimes when we're alone and maybe we're a little like frustrated, we're like, oh my God, how am I supposed to do all these things? And talking to other artists, we're like, wait, you're going through exactly the same thing. And of course, again, this is part of where we started our podcast was like, wait, have you tried this app? Have you tried this? Like, it's just that exchange of information of like, we're going through the same thing, but maybe I know something that could help you. And you know something that could help me and make it a little less, make that balancing act maybe a little bit easier by sharing information.
Yeah, and that's definitely, I mean, a common thread with all of our artists is even if they define success so differently, it's community is that common thread and how important it is within the arts community as well as just the larger community of where you live. All of our guests really prioritize that of community over competition mindset. So whether it's sharing advice, telling their story with the people around them, being super genuine and intentional with their business, with their creative practice, and building a community along the way as their career rises, as their creative voice is amplified. It's also amplifying the voices of others, which is definitely a common thread when we're thinking about artists that we have on the podcast. It's wanting to highlight artists that are highlighting other artists and just being megaphones for each other of that community over competition because was it rising tides lift all ships.
Yes.
And as you rise, who can you look back and pull up with you, which I think is a super, super powerful experience, which I just feel so blessed and privileged to be able to do on the podcast with you and with our listeners of, especially since we started almost 2 years ago now, of becoming in our local community at in-person events or when we're introduced to people, we're kind of becoming known as the podcast women of art space, which is still a little bit strange, but also super exciting to where in the beginning, I feel like there was maybe an imposter syndrome element of like, oh yeah, that thing that we do on the side, because again, these are such powerful conversations that we enjoy so much. Sometimes we forget that there are also other people listening. But having our listeners visit our studios, and it truly is an honor to be able to put faces to the names or faces to the stats of how many listeners we have, because we do just love picking the brain of so many talented artists and art professionals each and every week, and having the listeners comment on social media posts and message us about how that episode impacted them. It's truly, truly amazing. So thank you to everyone who's listened. It's been so fun.
And that's it. 100th up. No.
And now we're done. We're cutting it off forever. No, I would cry. It would be so sad.
I'm not ready for that. I'm not. I think in looking back, one of my favorite parts of, this whole process is the fact that we help facilitate conversations, not just about our own experiences, but also like the guests that we bring on. And it allows both aspiring artists as well as actual practicing artists, like the ability to learn a little bit more about the different ways in which they can balance their art making practice while still paying the bills, or at least trying to find ways in which to do so. So, talking to so many artists, I've learned a lot more ways of like, wait, you do what on the side to pay the bill? Yes, I love that idea. And some I'm like, okay, I don't love that idea, but I respect that. Like that's amazing. The hustle, you got to do what you got to do. But in reflecting about this, it's definitely a labor of love, but it's our way of giving back for that generous art community that, especially when we got started, so generous with us, helping us along the way. I have a question about this. Where do I get that? Where's the cheapest place to get the scheme? It's like all those things, or, oh, do you have an app for that? Like any of those suggestions, that just helped us out. This is our way of giving back. And we're definitely looking forward not only to more episodes, of course, but also perhaps we're cooking some in-person event ideas. We're marinating on that. Perhaps there could be a live podcast episode in the future. We'll see about that. So obviously stay tuned, but we're definitely looking to continue this podcast and increase the way in which we interact with the community.
Absolutely. So if you have been along the journey with us, whether you're just listening to the podcast, whether you've been here since day one, we just want to say thank you so much for your support as we launch this 100th episode. As we've mentioned, there's no sign of stopping, but don't forget to share this podcast with your artist friends. So send to them on social media, send them a text message with maybe one of your favorite episodes. And if you would like to support the podcast, help ensure that we are able to keep continuing it, becoming a podcast supporter is the best way to do that. So you can head on over to levelupartist.com to learn more about becoming a podcast supporter at our $4 tier. So just an extra $1 an episode where you get bonus content whenever we have guests on, or joining our art business community tier for weekly live calls and dozens of hours of education, content, PDF resources, the whole nine. Both tiers are so much fun. And we just want to say again, thank you so much for all of your support and continued support as we grow and learn more from career-minded artists.
Yep. And all the information is at levelupartist.com. So just want to mention that again. But that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much. And we hope you enjoyed it.
As always, our blog and website will be linked in today's show notes, where you'll find links to all of the podcast episodes that we referenced in today's video, as well as links to other podcast episodes.
And if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, you can follow us on social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artist on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.